Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for joining today's Resilient Connecticut webinar. It's 11 o'clock, so we're going to begin. I'm Katie Lund, CIRCA's Director of Engagement. I'll be moderating this hour-long webinar, which is part of a series that CIRCA hosts on a monthly basis with partners on a variety of adaptation and resilience topics relevant to our state. Before we begin and I introduce the speakers, I just want to mention a few mechanics if this is the first time you're joining us. The webinar is being recorded, and we will post that recording online along with the slides that you see today. You all have your audio muted. If you want to ask questions of the presenters, you simply have to type into the chat box what your question is and press enter, and then I'll be moderating these questions after the presentations, and we'll save time at the end. If you don't have your chat box open, it looks like kind of a cartoon like bubble in the lower middle part of your screen. So you just simply have to click on that. So today we're hearing perspectives from two coastal Connecticut towns that are in the process of forming resilience committees. We're fortunate actually to have the speakers joining us here in our CIRCA conference room to discuss their experience on this important topic. So we thank you all for joining us here. From Groton, we have Jessie Stratton, who is a member of the Groton Task Force leading their local resilience planning effort. We also have Dave Anderson, who is Madison's Director of Planning and Economic Development, and Tom Banisch, the first Selectman for Madison, who's also going to chime in on some of the slides. And then finally, last but not least, we have Joe MacDougald, UConn Professor in Residence and the Executive Director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Law. He is also a Madison resident. And Joe, because you were helpful in providing a presentation that CIRCA gave to Madison last April, I think we can kick it off by beginning hearing from you to help set the stage.
Sure. So hello, everyone. I'm going to be a bit brief. If any of you were on the July webinar, you'll see a few of the same slides. But I did want to talk a bit about the background that I think puts what towns and municipalities are facing in context, and I think what drives a bit of why we're seeing a lot of interest in resilience committees. Both Jim O'Donnell, the executive director of CIRCA, and I were up at the legislature on Monday. We were talking to Senator Cohen's Coastal Caucus, and we received questions about how towns can respond, how they should form their committees, and that's what I think these people will be talking about. Just to put a little of that in context with a few of the CIRCA slides. Did that advance?
Not yet.
Oh, sorry. We're slide advancing. So hold on 1 second, please.
I think you can keep going.
I can just talk through. So one of the things we talked about were the impacts that towns are experiencing. A lot of you, I'm sure, have an image of what that is. One thing that I think a message we wanted to get out from CIRCA and that we presented to Madison is that while big storms are an issue and inundation flooding is an issue, really what we think is one of the most significant things are the new normal flooding, where the 50-year storm becomes the 25-year storm, and the 25-year storm shows up every year. That's outside of a lot of our engineering expectations for how we view repeated flooding. Things that we're looking at is we're seeing reports of more frequent road flooding. There we go. Are we?
Yeah. So sorry, everyone. There seems to be a lag between the slide advancement now, but.
Excellent. So there you see at least one slide on some of the impacts. The next slide you'll see will include pictures of frequent flooding. If any of you have been down to Route 146 in Guilford, you'll recognize it. These are continuing problems that I think it's just one behind. I get it. These are continuing problems that towns are experiencing. So one of the a lot of towns are working on, and the new state law was it was passed as Public Act 1882. It says that towns should plan as part of their plan of conservation development process for 50 centimeters by 2050, roughly 2 feet. And what a lot of that was based on was Professor O'Donnell's work in taking the national climate models of sea level rise, applying them to Connecticut, or kind of Connecticutizing them, And noticing that when the image appears on your screen, you'll see that there's a series of spaghetti charts. It says it much more clearly. He says, when you look at 2100, there's enormous variability. By the time you look at 2050, you see that there's a around 50 centimeters by 2050. That number made it all the way into the legislation that was passed, and that's what municipalities are facing as their planning number. It's not a prediction; it's a 80% planning value that you're supposed to use. The slide you have up now is one that I think is important to realize, depending on where, important to understand, depending on where you're located in Connecticut. This is a slide showing storm return. And what it means is that one thing that we used to talk about when it came to storm surge was the idea that Connecticut will be getting increased storm surge, and one of our worries would be the higher value properties located in Greenwich and Fairfield, where had a lot of density and flat floodplain areas. And one consequence of the research shows us this. The lower red line, if you can see it on your screen, is roughly what will be the experience in terms of returning storms if you're located from New Haven to Greenwich. The upper line shows the return of higher impact storms going from New Haven up through the Rhode Island line. Basically, what you're seeing is that the areas from New Haven up will be getting increased storm surge, but at a much higher rate. And this has a real world consequence. When the next slide appears, we'll see that that once we knew that this was part of the physical consequence, we thought we would test it. We surveyed coastal towns and we wanted how the towns were adjusting their base flood elevation. This is something within the control of the town. If you haven't run into the term, what it means roughly is there's a height of which you have to build the first floor above a certain elevation, and it's largely set by FEMA. The towns can increase that height. And we said, well, if it's true that the area from New Haven onward is experiencing or will experience continuing storm surge, probably have been for a while. And what this chart shows is something pretty interesting, that without talking to each other, having really a coordinated message from just on their own, you'll see that the towns, if you kind of look at New Haven and cast your eyes off to the right-hand part of the map, had been organically increasing their base flood elevations based on their real world experience. And as we kind of make our way down, going toward west, you'll see that those towns hadn't had the need to do it yet. The physics of this are ill-equipped to be described by a law professor, but something along the idea the area as we go out toward Rhode Island is less wavy, so small increments of sea level rise on a percentage basis make a much bigger difference. And what we'll see is the message is that when it comes to storm return rate, it's all bad news, but it's bad news going in toward Fairfield County, and it's even worse news our way up through New London County in terms of the storm surge return. This then came to the thing we're talking about here, Public Act 1882. I'm not going to describe too much of it, but I did want to highlight two quick. The first is this quote from former Commissioner Rob Klee. It says, CIRCA's current projection of 50 centimeters of sea level rise in Long Island Sound year 2050 is not a prediction, nor does it represent a mean value or likely outcome. Instead, the scenario establishes a reasonable upper bound for the purposes of adaptation and planning. So when towns are wrestling with this idea of the 50 centimeters, they have to look at that and say, this is our planning number. How are we going to adjust to it? The other thing I want to point out is that towns have an obligation to put these scenarios into their plan of conservation and development when they're adopting it. If any of you have been involved in municipal planning, you know that that plan of conservation development serves as a guide for how the towns will enact regulations, how they'll adjust to their planning going across for years. When I was a zoner in Madison, I know we went back to the POCD constantly, and the process really does work. The other thing that I wanted to point out to everyone is that this model, this 50 centimeters by 2050, will be updated every 10 years. And hopefully, my belief, and I hope others believe that, is that it'll be updated much more frequently. Connecticut moved from having a static view of sea level rise, one that was historically presented, and now has a moving scientific target as part of this legislation. and that we'll all have to adopt to it. So these represent big changes. How can towns start to adjust to them? One way is through the work, the UConn part of CIRCA. It started out by generating white papers. Some of those papers discussed things like how do you adjust for floodplain building elevations? How do you put those and actually change your BFE within your town? Also, how do you avoid the problem that some people call it the Oreo problem, or how do you avoid having houses that look like the old Jetsons where increase the height on stilts, but you haven't increased the roof line. The houses are supposed to get flatter. That never really works. So we did a survey of how towns can engage with different ways to deal with height restrictions. And it's a different legislative ideas. And towns have been adopting some of the work in these white papers. But I think the place that towns really are going to go next is what we're going to talk about. CIRCA came down at the request of Dave Anderson and the Selectmen in Madison and talk about zones of shared risk and other ways that towns need to think about the problems that they've been having. And we use Madison as an example. So Alex Felsen, who's a CIRCA member and was on that July webinar, looked at some historic maps as to how we think about zoning versus how we think about zones of shared risk. The idea that traditional zoning doesn't really follow the water. One of my favorite images is this marshmallowy map. It will be coming up on your screen. And what I like about that is, as someone who used to be a zoner myself, is that it lets you see that while we may think of the surf club as one zone and the residence as another, really, until we're following the water or the likely zones of flooding, we really aren't preparing in the way we could be. And I think this is common for all towns, is to look at what the risk is for storm surge and to then start to adapt your plans around the physical reality. If any of you are interested, or if you're in the planning process, we have a tool available for you on the CIRCA website. We have created 3 visualizations. They look on your screen like pictures, but they're actually engineering diagrams that contain call outs to regulations, planning issues. We work to create 3 scenarios, sort of individual home level, neighborhood level, and town level. And in these 3 scenarios, we try to capture as many of the common problems that exist throughout coastal towns. So you could use that as part of your planning discussion. It always isn't the easiest to put up a picture of your actual town that has residents with their actual homes, or to get all the issues in one place. So we put these up as a service to try and see if it can help with your planning discussions. So we gave this presentation to Madison. We talked about the different areas the different techniques you can use for planning for resilience. And I was delighted that within a very short period of time, the Selectmen, led by your next speaker, Dave Anderson, who helped them, started a Coastal Resilience Commission, a charter level group to actually evaluate these issues and figure out Madison's response. So with that background, turn it over to Dave Anderson.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Again, I'm Dave Anderson, Director of Planning and Economic Development with Madison. Here with me today is Tom Banisch, our first selectman, who is very instrumental in getting this group going. I'm just going to do a brief bit of background and go into a little bit of, I think, what towns should be doing to get the most out of the technical assistance meetings that CIRCA offers. Talk to you a little bit about the process leading to the commission formation, discuss the charge and the structure of the commission, and then hopefully go into a little bit of where we're going from here. Again, I've been in Madison since 2012, and prior to that, I was in the town of East Haven as the planning and zoning administrator. So I happened to be in East Haven for Tropical Storm Irene and in Madison for Superstorm Sandy. So this stuff has definitely resonated with me in my professional career. And Tom's been Madison's first selectman since 2015. So a little bit about our kind of where Madison is in terms of planning for coastal resilience. We received a community development block grant that was granted to Brantford, Milford, and Madison, and we were able to work with Malone and McBroom to adopt a coastal resilience plan, which we did in 2016. That was an excellent plan. I think Malone and McBroom did a great job, and there's a lot of great recommendations in there. We also have a multi-jurisdiction hazard mitigation plan that we work with the COG on. We have a regional framework for coastal resilience, again with Adam Welchel and the Nature Conservancy. And as Joe mentioned earlier, we have our 2013 Plan of Conservation and Development. So we have a lot of great planning documents that set kind of a little bit of the stage of what we should be doing. Unfortunately, some of those documents had been sitting on the shelf. And I think that's a little bit of part of the reason why we got involved with CIRCA a little bit more directly, because we wanted to advance our thinking around coastal resilience and take a little bit more action. At the same time, hopefully, as a lot of you are noticing, we're experiencing a lot more frequent flooding events from just non-routine storms. And, you know, in addition to myself and the first selectman driving around during heavy rainstorms, you know, a lot of people in town are noticing these things, and they're starting to ask some questions. At the same time, the Planning and Zoning Commission amended some regulations to ease the process for elevating existing homes. So previously, if you had a higher elevation, your roof was at the height limit, you'd have to go into the Zoning Board of Appeals to try to get a variance to elevate your home. We eliminated that requirement to make it easier for people to do that. And we actually have one home being elevated right now 2 feet above the BFE, and they did that through an administrative process. The Planning and Zoning Commission recommended that the Board of Selectmen take a look at our current flood and erosion control ordinance to institute a look back period. Right now, you can do substantial improvements every year. 50% one year, then wait a year, and you can do another 50%. So we're recommended to adopt a 5-year look back period. And we also recommended that you saw on the map that Joe provided previously that Madison was just at the BFE. We're recommending that our erosion control ordinance go 2 feet above the BFE. So myself and the chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission went to a Board of Selectmen meeting and made these recommendations, and the selectmen were very interested and said, you know what, we think this is great, but we want to hear from some experts. So that's the point in time we invited CIRCA in to come and assist us. And so Joe did a good job of explaining a little bit of the nuts and bolts about the technical assistance that's being offered. So I don't want to go too far into that, but I do want to give a little bit of tips I think that towns can do to prepare for a successful meeting. One thing that we did well is we got decision makers all in the same room. So we had a joint meeting with the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Board of Selectmen. State Representative Noreen Kokaruda was in attendance. State Senator Christine Cohen was in attendance, and we did a good job of public outreach just to get people in the seats. So there was a lot of folks in the room that night that benefited from the presentation. One thing that Joe mentioned previously is specific examples. And while some people do get concerned when you talk about their particular house, when you talk about here's some impacts to roads and areas of town, that does resonate with people in the room. So I think working with CIRCA to help them understand what are some areas that the town is concerned with, and then they can do a little bit of analysis and kind of illustrate that, what some of the impacts might be. And I can't emphasize enough, you're going to see me return to this a couple of times, get press coverage. So our technical assistance meeting was covered by the local newspaper, and it was filmed for public television. And you'll see now this is just a screenshot of a article we got in the paper just directly after the meeting. And so a couple of things from the Madison meeting I think are takeaways. I think one thing that Joe mentioned is this zones of shared risk concept, which is kind of, to me, a little bit of neighborhood level planning. It just gives you a way to look at this. It doesn't become just this vast problem for the entire town of Madison. You can look at it on specific neighborhood basis. And I think it helps people just comprehend that, yes, this is a challenge, but we can formulate solutions to address these issues. One thing that I'm a strong proponent of is Public Act 1882. I think it's really important to explain the science, but I think you need to move past it. Actually, in our first Coastal Resilience Commission, someone brought up the idea, well, we really need to understand about these projections. And I said, we can certainly talk about that and discuss that, but Public Act 1882 requires towns to plan for this eventuality. And I think that helps you get over that really big hurdle, because there are people out there that are going to question the science and aren't going to believe it's going to be as bad as people say it's going to be. But Public Act 1882 for me has been very helpful in getting over that hurdle. And then perhaps the most important thing is, I think at the end of the meeting, you need to have a next step identified. And I very specifically remember me raising my hand, kind of frantically waving, saying, hey, what's next, guys? And I had suggested this idea of establishing a commission. And, other towns may have a different outcome from a meeting like this, but I think it's important to really identify that next step. And so the reason why we chose to form a commission is, as I mentioned before, the plans were kind of sitting on a shelf. We didn't feel like the existing board and commission structure allowed for sufficient focus on the issue. Planning and Zoning Commission, they have busy doing other things. They're very concerned about this topic, but they have applications that come in on a routine basis. We have to deal with a whole range of topics. So we didn't feel that anybody really could handle this under their existing responsibilities. I also felt that establishing a new commission elevated the dialogue around the issue quite a bit and led to a greater sense of community awareness. And thankfully, one of the other reasons is we had multiple residents express interest in helping out. People that have served on boards and commissions and taken a hiatus in the past, and this was a topic that they wanted to get back involved in. And so that was some of the reasons that led to our decision to form the commission. You'll see I put together a brief timeline here. We had the technical assistance meeting on May 2nd, drafted a charge a few weeks later that got reviewed by both P&Z and then to the Board of Selectmen. And then we established this commission on town meeting on June 24th. So that's a very short timeline to institute a new commission. But I felt it was important, and the Selectmen felt it was important to take advantage of some of the momentum that we gained from this technical assistance meeting. Because as Joe said before, it takes certain events for people to kind of realize that this is a big priority, and we didn't want to wait for a storm event again. We don't want to wait to try to recover from a storm, so we took advantage of this opportunity. And then we took a little bit of our time establishing the board and appointing members. And one thing we did a little differently is we reached out side of our regular board and commission nomination process, which typically comes through the political parties. And we put announcements in the paper, said, hey, if anybody's interested in helping out, submit an application. And we got over 20 applicants for the commission. And we continued again to work with the press. And so you'll just see here, there's just, follow-up articles looking for volunteers, formally establishing the commission. And then that, when it was appointed, this was just a few weeks ago. So I'll go briefly into the charge of the commission. And so, excuse me. The Madison Coastal Resiliency Commission shall be charged with evaluating the impacts of climate change and sea level rise in the town of Madison, and shall develop a resiliency plan to formulate a resiliency and adaptation strategy to address potential impacts to roads, municipal parks and facilities, other critical municipal infrastructure, public and private on-site septic systems, and emergency response services. Commission shall also conduct education and public outreach activities to communicate its findings and recommendations, and shall provide budgetary recommendations to the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance. Madison Coastal Resiliency Commission shall report directly to the Board of Selectmen in carrying out its duties. In executing its charge, Coastal Resiliency Committee shall work closely with appropriate state agencies, including the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation and the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, to assist in evaluating the projected impacts of climate change and sea level rise, engage technical consultants as needed to assist in the execution of this charge, conduct an initial public educational event after a 6-month study obligation, and then within 18 months, develop a resiliency plan for consideration and adopted by the Board of Selectmen. Upon adoption of the initial resiliency plan, propose capital projects for inclusion in the town's 5-year capital improvement plan, and provide input into the plan of conservation and development, hazard mitigation plan, and Board of Selectmen strategic plan update processes. Hold at least one public engagement event annually and interface with community stakeholders on an ongoing basis, and keep in close contact with the Board of Selectmen by providing quarterly updates. So some of the key components of that charge, there's a real emphasis on municipal assets, so things that we can actually that will result in projects start identifying some of these adaptation solutions. But they also recognize septic systems. So we don't want to elevate a section of road. The houses are all elevated, the road's not flooding, but then these septic systems are getting inundated. So we want to look at that fairly globally. And I say, forming a new resiliency plan, again, I mentioned the 2016 plan is an excellent plan. We didn't do with it what we should have, and we're using this opportunity to take a closer look at that 2016 plan, have a bigger emphasis on community involvement and staff involvement, and basically adopt a new plan based largely on some of the findings in that. And so I think that'll be a success of this. We're also focusing on coordinating with the capital improvement plan. Right now, there's no money for resiliency projects, so this an outcome of that will be some actual projects in the CIP, and there's obviously a big emphasis on ongoing communication. And then briefly, the commission, we have 19 members, which is a lot. So one of the things I mentioned, we had a lot of people raise their hands as being interested in this topic, and it was surprising the people that came out of the woodwork and the talents that they had, and we didn't want to turn people away that were excited to help out. So we nominated 19 members. Ultimately, a few folks decided they didn't have the time after all to help us out. But we have 7 members on an executive committee, and then 12 additional members that will serve on 3 separate subcommittees, one being technical, they'll focus on resiliency solutions, one will be communication, will be focused on soliciting input and disseminating information to the public, and another will be policy, which will be focused on coordinating recommendations with other municipal policies and regulations. For Madison, it's a little unique because I'm serving on the commission as an actual voting member. Typically, we just have staff liaisons. In kind of the original thought process, there was actually going to be a few other staff also serving on this commission, such as the town engineer, director of health, potentially emergency services director, and we may move towards that in the future. I didn't want to volunteer anybody else for additional night meetings, so we started with me.
But I think it's important that we're going to liaise with them.
Yes.
They will be involved. It's just maybe not full time.
Correct. Yes, they'll be involved, and we'll definitely lean on their expertise quite a bit. And then where we are today is we held the first meeting on October 22nd of the executive committee, and it was a very good meeting. Everybody agrees, with the direction we're going. We're going to convene the entire commission on November 19th, and we're inviting Joe and back just to kind of just get everybody moving in the same direction. Their next steps are to determine subcommittee appointments. Again, do a really thorough review and evaluation of the 2016 Coastal Resilience Plan, determine our technical assistance needs, and then formulate a budget request for fiscal year 2021. We do not have a budget at this point, but during all the conversations we've had with the selectmen, we will have a budget. We just need to determine what our needs will be. So, and Tom is here, so I'm holding him to that. Thank you very much.
I thought it was really interesting how you talked about how the Public Act 1882 was a motivator, but that it's not holding you back from what you're doing, and it was kind of you're moving past to kind of more proactive planning. I do want to point out that a couple of the articles that Dave highlighted are actually linked on the webinar's announcement page, so that people want to read those in more detail. I know you had a slide about that, but yeah, so I wanted to let people know that. So let's transition to hearing from Jessie, and it'll be interesting to hear the comparison between the two efforts. So thank you, Jessie.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. It's interesting because I think Madison's process sort of grew out of efforts that the town had already undertaken and established a commission. In Groton's case, that had happened almost 10 years ago and was sort of let lie. And so this effort, the new Groton Resilience and Sustainability Task Force, was the outcome of conversations from some residents in town with our current town council. And so the town council then passed a resolution establishing this, and Madison invited people to submit applications to serve on it. We are not as big as you may be an asset in some ways, and, but also much closer to your executive committee style. We are 5 regular members and 2 alternates. And
So what you see
oh,
here
I
is
see.
one of
Okay. Our charge was fairly broad. It was not as specific as Madison's, but these were the primary elements of it. We did not help write this charge, so it's a big charge, and sometimes it's a little daunting to look at it. It is basically the area that we are working in, and as you can see, anybody who's involved with CIRCA, that a lot of it was from CIRCA's mission, which I think was a very appropriate thing to do. As Dave out, there are many, many documents that have done a great deal of work on this subject already. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have the resources to reinvent the wheel, but these are some of the primary ones that we spent the summer reading and have a process where we're going forward to meet with the town officials that were responsible for creating these programs. Many of them have recommendations in them already. And we have been in the process of meeting with town departments to find out when of those recommendations have been put into effect, to ask them what they think are the most critical ones on that. I think somewhat differently, this general thing, when we were first formed in February, our first charge was trying to address a specific situation in the town of Groton. Groton Long Point is connected to the town of Groton by a causeway and bridge that were built in 1936, and they are very low lying and are the only access and egress to over 600 homes. So that is a particular process. And one of the first things we did was meet with Malone McBroom, who are doing the design for that. And they are now updating their plans for that bridge to include the sea level rise established by the state. One thing I'd like to correct before it goes out again is i've seen that chart that Joe put up of the base of the freeboard requirements in towns is 1 foot above sea level. And we are pretty sure that we will be recommending that it be higher than that, but it has taken a step in that direction anyway. So as we sort of looked at how do we address all these issues, we have divided our work into several areas here, and members of the task force, and you'll see that there are more than 7 things, so some people are going to have to work on more than one, but each is taking responsibility for sort of becoming the gatherer of information and recommendations in these different areas. Face many of the same issues that Madison does. Interestingly, when we get to wastewater and electric power, we have 2 utilities in town. We have a municipal utility and Eversource, and the town operating a wastewater treatment plant. So same kind of issues that arise in Madison and other coastal things, concerns about, I think, particularly with wastewater, the resiliency of pumping stations. Many of them, because they are all gravity fed, lie very, very low. And there has been a concerted effort in town to already raise infrastructure needs, electric power and things above that 2 foot base flood level based on the 50 centimeters of sea level rise. But we are going through each of these in a category. We started our work in February, so we've been at it a little longer, but at this point what we are primarily doing is meeting with our directors of these various parts of the town to find out what they are doing. Those have been very, very valuable meetings and helpful as we go forward. I am very jealous of the staff and the commitment of funding Madison has made to this. It was very clear when we were first formed that there was not the ability to provide our task force with that. And I think in addition to the expertise of the towns, and our departments are certainly working with us and being very, very responsive to our requests. But when you go to trying to implement these measures, we all know it comes down to resources being available. And if you go through the update plans or the recommendations of previous documents put together for the town, not implemented due to lack of resources. And I think probably most important, if these task forces are going to be able to really help answer those needs and enable the towns to go forward, they need a dedicated grant writer. There is not a lot of money out there, and it takes someone really working on that. And I do not know of much of any examples where a grant writer was hired and did more than pay for themselves in terms of the return. CIRCA, as you've already heard, is an incredibly valuable resource. The mapping and information that helps us get down to the granular in terms of areas, and particularly true, start to look at things like this bridge causeway out to Groton Long Point. Let's raise it, but then the yards are all below it. And we create lakes in people's front yards if the road gets overtaken by storm surge or whatever, and run into all sorts of issues which are addressed in some of the papers that Joe referred to. Two other things. FEMA has a community system, which many of you are probably aware of. Towns enroll in it, and you get a score on the basis of actions you take, and score lowers the FEMA insurance premiums, flood insurance premiums, and it's a very simple thing for towns to do, and you can continue to make progress, and obviously has benefits for vulnerable properties. The other one I want people to be aware of is the Institute for Business and Home Safety has developed an incredible set of building standards, fortified home standards, and there's a bronze level, a silver level, a gold level, but it addresses things like, certainly the freeboard requirements, but relatively inexpensive things that dramatically improve the resilience of homes, from roof tie downs to when you put the plywood on a roof to tape it so that if the roof shingles blow off, there is not water incursion into the home and things like that. So when damage occurs or in new construction, I think this is standards that towns can certainly look at. We all must comply with the state building code, but we can add other requirements. And this is certainly a very valuable resource to that end. Funding, money. As I said, there are limited grants available, and I love that I misspelled or left out the N in government. Is that good enough for government work kind of thing? I noticed that this morning and I went, oh, okay. There is a collaboration among a bunch of not-for-profits that goes under the name Climate Resilience Fund grants. They tend to be very specific, but it is worth looking at. As David said, obviously, a town's capital budget is going to have to address some of these items, but we all know the political desire to keep town expenses low. Another program which I thought was going to have sunsetted, but what's known as low RECs and zero RECs, so zero renewable energy credits. Starting in 2012, the state of Connecticut created this program whereby the utilities will contract with an entity to help fund, it is funded by that, and buy the renewable energy credits from either zero emission sources or low emission sources like fuel cells. That has been renewed several times, not for the same amount. It started out at $8 million a year for 15-year contracts. A big omnibus energy bill was passed in 2018, and it extended that program for another 2 years. And the purpose of that is that the legislature, DEEP, and our public utilities regulatory authority are going through a process of trying to establish a value for what distributed generation like solar and things bring to the overall system. And until that's established, these programs are just being allowed to continue, even though they will sunset when that happens. Power purchase agreements. When a town, because you can't take the tax credits, but you can contract with somebody who can to install backup generation, things like that. Our town's interested in exploring the idea of what might microgrid in that we have a town hall, police station, Department of Public Works, and a high school and soon to be middle school all on the top of one hill in town, an ideal location to provide shelter and emergency services. The Municipal and Climate Change and Coastal Resiliency Reserve Funds. This is legislation that was passed this year that enables towns to establish a specific account. Obviously, they need to designate funding to go into that account. Towns probably could do this anyway, but it's nice for statutory advertising, do it, and create a reserve that is building up to be able to do some of these things. And lastly, the Connecticut Green Bank, which has funded a lot of the new clean energy work in the state, created this Green Bank Solar Municipal Assistance Program. It has not gotten off the ground. There is a webinar this November 12th that if people go on Connecticut, ctgreenbanks.com solar map, you can register for this webinar and they will explain what that's going to be. So that's pretty much where we are, and lots of work to do, and getting to know the other members of our task force very well, which is really nice.
Thank you, Jessie. I am going to transition a little bit to a website to show, I guess, some resources that you mentioned. One of the concepts in your presentation was not reinventing the wheel and working off of existing plans. I'm going to, I guess, transition while we wait for some chat questions to come in to a website to show on our page, our Resilient Connecticut page, where we actually have put together an inventory of some existing planning efforts that might be helpful for listeners to know where they are. And just while I do this, a reminder that if you do have questions, please enter them in that chat box using that kind of bubble. And after you type your question, just press enter to make sure that we can see it.
In fact, can I preload a question to both of you?
Yes, you can.
So the question we got from just on Monday from some of the legislators was very much on the structure of your commissions. And the question that I think a couple people had it is, what were the pros and cons of your process to make it a report to the Board of Selectmen versus using, the Planning and Zoning Commission, Conservation Commission, or one of those? And the other backup question is, are you concerned about volunteer dilution? How did you go about staffing this, and what was your thought processes?
Yeah, I'll jump in, and Tom, you can add to it. So, one of the things that I felt was important is there's projects that are recommended in our 2016 Coastal Resiliency Plan, and those projects aren't funded by the Planning and Zoning Commission. Obviously, those projects are funded by the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance. And so I felt it was really important that this group reported to the Board of Selectmen for that reason. And also, these are big impacts to the town, and potentially are going to cost big capital expenditures. And I think it's really appropriate that the Board of Selectmen understand and have a full appreciation for the recommendations that come out of this committee. I would have been concerned in general with volunteers, because we do have difficult time getting people to staff our boards and commissions. But this topic was of such importance to a lot of people in our community that they raise their hand when they don't normally serve on boards and commissions, but they felt this was really important. Or in one case, we had Joe knows Hank McGuire, the former chair of our Planning and Zoning Commission, who went into retirement, came out of retirement from serving on boards and commissions just to do this, and he's now chairing our new commission. And so we were really fortunate that I think if you publicize this enough, I think communities are probably very similar to ours, where there's a lot of talented people in your community that will probably help out.
But that's the reason why we wanted to keep everybody involved, because we had 18 people who were very interested, had great experience and backgrounds, and we didn't want to lose that talent. And if we just took 6 of them and put them with Dave, there'd be another 12 that we're just wasting. So they want to participate. We have work that they can do.
The only thing I would add to that is I think one of the reasons ours is so small is that it was not preceded by the type of public meeting that you had in Madison. So when that request for application out, it was not as well distributed or people in town didn't know about it as much. Certainly folks that had on the previous commission and our current chair of our task force was chair of that task force too. And that report of, now 8 years ago, 9 years ago, people who were involved in that expressed an interest. But while I think we all feel overwhelmed by the amount of work there is to do for 7 people, it does make our work very easy. And we certainly, application process, I think, got people that were very, very interested in this material or subject.
So we do have some more specific questions that are coming in about zoning and road flooding, but one general question that maybe you can both speak to is, could you comment on the transparency you will have with the Coastal Resiliency Commission? Would you have their meetings covered by public cable access, or have, how are you approaching that level of transparency?
Our meetings are certainly open and we have an opportunity for public comment. It has usually been the mayor that is at those meetings and other town council members. One of our charges is public education. So I think that's where that will really be addressed, is putting together the kind of meeting you had. At this point, we're primarily just working with the town council and we'll be making a report to them, but certainly the meetings are completely open.
Yeah, same with our meetings are open to the public, and since half the town is serving on the commission anyway, it's probably not as big of an issue for us, but a huge emphasis on public outreach and public education. Several people that are on the commission represent different associations, beach associations that line our shoreline. So I think we'll hopefully have a little bit of an easy time communicating some of our thinking to the wider public.
Okay. Are there dedicated funds set aside for staff training at the local level? Are there continuing ed credits that could be assigned for people that are involved? Have you guys explored that at all?
Yeah, explored that. No.
We have.
Okay.
I think that's one of the first things we're going to have them look at is, will their financial needs be going forward?
Yep.
So that we can start to address that.
Yeah, somewhat informally, the commission has already started kind of educating each other. They find an interesting article, they send it around,
Yeah,
and so some of that's happening fairly organically. And I do think when we find out about opportunities to come to Resilient Connecticut seminars and things like that, we'll get people to go.
I think the other thing that I've been struck with in meeting with the directors of some of our town departments is they are doing this on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And the state provides a lot of resources, whether it's through, the specific agency that oversees and requires those reports to be submitted, or whether it's some kind of broader thing than that. But I think we've been impressed with the degree to which our town officials get this.
It's been an interesting trend up at the law school for the Center for Environmental Law. We do a lot either with CIRCA, with other groups that tend to be climate focused, and we get a lot of municipal officials that sign up for it. It's not just attorneys and legislators. It's a lot of town people.
Yeah. Have you considered how to fund some of the studies and work you might be needing through bonding? That's one of, I guess, financing resilience that I know you had a really great slide on.
And I wish I could put 3 slides up on that, but there are resources out there, but they take time to pursue. And I really would encourage any town that is doing this to look into this new Green Bank program. I think it will be very interesting to see what they actually do. That is really focus, and I should say, on the energy component of it, resilient in the way of distributed generation, whether it's solar or whatever, but it's an important resource.
And we've just talked a little bit about the reserve fund concept, so we'll be exploring that a little bit further. Then I'll be following up. I wasn't familiar with all the research Jessie put up, so I'll be following up on a lot of those as well.
Yeah. And Jessie, you mentioned a grant writer, a dedicated grant writer. Is this position in Groton focused on resilience, or do they write other grants like educational needs in the community, or is it focused on resilience?
Our recommendation would be that, and the town is currently looking at hiring a sustainability director for the town. That person would probably have very specific grant writing responsibilities, but well, I've seen a draft job description. I haven't seen it, and the person has not been hired. But I think it really, and I think First Selectman Banisch is really right. For the town to be really pursuing this in any kind of serious way, there has to be funding or staffing attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I do want to do the usual pitch. Most towns, or a lot of towns, have the CIP process, capital improvement
Right.
plans. A lot of some of the things that we're hearing about road failures that are too early and that sort of thing are very much things that are going to just have to schedule once they're aware of it. Spending the money anyway, it's now spending it correctly.
Right.
So that there is a bit of help. The bad news is usually it means we're spending more money on maintenance over time, but it's going to be impacted whether we do it or not.
Sure that this question is a little more specific to a particular resilience impact. So I'll ask, we'll see if you guys can answer it from your own perspectives, but are there new road construction techniques to address this more frequent flooding impact? So are your communities considering different road construction techniques, elevation or materials, or do we just keep doing the same repaving approach over and over again? Impervious surface, so these ideas.
No, I think that's a very important question, and I'm not an authority on it by any stretch of the imagination. But the state has adopted what's known as an MS4 permitting process for stormwater management. And that whole process is embracing different standards to deal with things like runoff, increased rain, and the kind of things that we're seeing today and saw last week or Monday when we got 3 inches of rain in a day. Our systems are just not built to deal with that. So when we are repaving a road, do we need to change the culvert size? One that I think we were impressed with talking with our public works director was when repaving the road, let's narrow it up a little bit. It saves money, but it also, I think we were told that they had gotten back 5 acres of, a permeable surface as opposed to impermeable surface by doing that over the years. So there are, and again, there are state DOT runs webinars and things like that and helps train people in terms of that kind of work.
Great. Okay. Joe, it seems like you can maybe answer this one. I'm not clear on the concept of shared risk zoning. Can you help me understand the real estate taxes under this approach?
So the idea of the sort of zone of shared risk is to break the model of just traditional zoning, the way that we've laid out properties, because a lot of that wasn't done with the natural features in mind. And to really look to say, who are the areas that are going to be most impacted, not just by big storms, but by the new normal flooding storm that I think we all have stories about. Where does that water go? Where do those people need to go? And the diagrammatic approach that I mentioned Alex came up with is to look at these common areas. Some may cross over between commercial and residential, but yet they're all experiencing the same flood, and start to on that basis for a zone of shared risk. I don't really have a decent answer at this time for real estate taxes. I do think there are a lot of legislative and legal opportunities to adopt new structures to bring neighborhoods together like we do in many other contexts, whether it's historic districts or other groups. One of my LM students did some wonderful work on this basis. But right now, the idea is to say we're going to be experiencing a higher level of flooding, storms, rainfall, even nuisance rainfall. Where does that water go? How does it flow? How should we be looking at that common region? I think
just to add to that, it's
Please.
not answering a question, but one of the other things that I think we have been very surprised to learn, and I think our town has, that given these rainfall events, the incursion of fresh rainwater into the sewage collection system is really being taxed, and at like 40% of what is being collected in those times in the sewage treatment system is not wastewater, and that's a both in terms of capacity and where it goes out into the outfall pipes and stuff.
Okay. The last question I'm going to take here is related to more CIRCA, and so I can try and answer this. People were asking about CIRCA's technical assistance and the services we have, and I think that probably came to mind when hearing about this meeting that we had in Madison with your community, Dave. And so, CIRCA, unfortunately, our 2 grant programs that many people know of, our Municipal Resilience Grant Program and our Matching Funds Grant Program, are kind of sunsetting at the end of 2019, and we're continuing to look for additional resources to continue those, because we've definitely been hearing from communities that those have been really helpful. But in the meantime, until some new form of coming to support those grant programs. We do have a focus, and I'm bringing this website up for those of you that are still looking at your screen. Our Resilient Connecticut project has a new focus in New Haven and Fairfield counties, and so the assistance that we provided you in Madison kind of came under this new umbrella. And so, you know, those two counties are kind of CIRCA's focus for a lot of work moving forward over the next 3 years. And I wanted to point out that we have a summit on November 12th, the Resilient Connecticut Summit. It's the first summit of this project. And if you go into our Resilient Connecticut website, you can see a more detailed program about this event. Katie Dykes will be providing a welcome address. And she is going to be followed by a roundtable panel of different state agencies who are part of the State Agencies Fostering Resilience Roundtable. So this is more of a dialogue and interaction and an opportunity for people in the audience to be asking questions of state agencies. And then we have a keynote address by Sean O'Rourke, shown here, who's the director of resiliency and is helping to lead the Resilient Roadie effort he's going to be speaking about. And we're asking him to also speak to how they are doing things like financing in our neighboring Rhode Island. So he'll be speaking to that topic as part of the keynote of this event. And then in the afternoon, I just wanted to highlight that we're having 3 different tracks of breakout sessions that not only are part of this particular project, but are part of resilience thinking at a regional level, but also could be you know, another way for stakeholders to provide input and direct some work based on the needs of their communities moving forward. So we have 3 tracks: regional resilience planning, climate and public, and technical tool development, where we'll have a demonstration of a new vulnerability assessment tool. And if any of you were at our event at the law school, Joe, 2 springs ago, where Peter Minuti presented kind of an interactive charrette, he is going to be leading a charrette using some of this vulnerability assessment information, looking at 3 communities. And so I just wanted to highlight that event is happening in a couple weeks. And if you're interested in registering, please go in. I think actually registration closes November 1st. So happy Halloween to everybody, because it's October 31st and the registration will be closing tomorrow. The only other note about this event, since it is happening in November, we're not going to have a monthly Resilient Connecticut webinar in the month of November. So we'll resume these opportunities for all of you that are on the line in December. And so with that, I think we're very close to the top of the hour. I just want to make sure and thank all the participants for attending. I'll check if there's one last question, but I think that's it at this point. And I do want to say a warm thank you to all of you who are in our room. This is the first webinar where we've actually had people attending around our conference table, so it feels very community-like. And I think you all had very important ideas and methods and experiences to share on this topic that many communities I think are wrestling with in the state. So we appreciate it this morning, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
All right.
So how many people?